Hello everybody, welcome to this video lecture on Emily Dickinson. As usual, I hope you have the PowerPoint slideshow open. If not, pause me, go ahead and go get it, and hit the play button again when you have it open. Alright, so Emily Dickinson is considered one of the greatest American poets ever. She was actually one of the two people, in addition to Walt Whitman, who have been credited with creating a distinctly American voice, or a distinctly American poetry. So, it would just not be fair to study poetry and not at least look at Dickinson's poetry. So that's what we're going to do today in this lecture. Dickinson herself is kind of given a bit of a bad rap as far as everybody thinks that she was some hermit that hid out in her home in Amherst, Massachusetts, never spoke to anybody, just did nothing but write poetry, and then it was all published after she died. She did stay home in Amherst. She did go to college for 1 year at a school that is now known as Mount Holyoke College, but it was known under a different name at the time. Got homesick after a year, came back home to the same house that she grew up in, and she stayed there until her death. And she died at the age of 56. So she stayed there her entire life. But she wasn't exactly a hermit. She actually did socialize with people. In fact, she had many good friends, and she did fall in love with guys. The men did not return her affections, so you can see as you look at slide number 2 on this that unrequited love is a theme that she approaches. That's because in real life she didn't get it. There's not a whole lot of ways in which we can connect the poetry of her life with her life. She grew up in a very strict household. Her father was a Calvinist. Calvinists are very strict. If you don't know what they are, they're the ones that came up with predestination and things of that nature. So he's kind of a hellfire brimstone guy. But Dickinson, even though there is a type of spiritual and a type of religious tone to her poetry, it's not really been determined that she was actually a practicing Christian. But she did speak of those things in her poetry. Yes, it's true that she did not publish a lot when she was alive. She might have published 10 poems at the most. After her death, she had instructed her sister to burn all of her poetry. Luckily for the world, her sister read the poetry and said, "Hey, wait a minute, this is brilliant." So instead of burning the poetry, she turned it over to a book publisher who then published the poems, and boom, Emily Dickinson was a success posthumously. So that is kind of Emily Dickinson in a nutshell. I could spend a long time talking about Dickinson and her life and most of her poetry, but we've got here a slideshow that will actually touch on a couple of these things. Hymn meter is a type of meter, and you can see it as 4-line stanzas with iambic tetrameter, which means iambic, if you don't know what that means, an iamb is 2 syllables where the first syllable is unstressed and the second syllable is stressed. Most of the time, poetry is written in iambic because we as people tend to stress every other syllable in our speaking, and we usually unstress the first syllable. So that's why iamb is the choice here. Tetrameter, tetra by definition means 4. So it's 4 poetic feet, which makes 8 syllables. Each poetic foot is 2 syllables. We've got 8 of those in the tetrameter line, and each of those feet has an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. Lines 2 and 4 are iambic trimeter. So if you think of a tricycle having 3 wheels, tri, or a triangle, being a shape with 3 sides, then trimeter obviously would be 3 poetic lines. 6 syllables, or 3 poetic feet, which means 6 syllables, and they are in iambic. And in the rhyme scheme, you can see that lines 1 and 2 don't always rhyme, but lines 2 and 4 do. So that is the hymn meter, and that is what a lot of Emily Dickinson's poetry is written in, including the first poem we're going to look at, which is Because I Could Not Stop for Death. Many people, when they think of Emily Dickinson, this is the poem they think of. Most people think of Because I Could Not Stop for Death when they think about Emily Dickinson. Now, there are several others that we're not going to read in this class that people think of. For example, After Great Pain. Let's see, what's the title of that poem? After Great Pain, a Formal Feeling Comes. A lot of people, when they think of Emily Dickinson, think of that particular poem. We're not reading that in this class, but you should read it, and you should try to understand it, because really, I could only pick about 2 poems for this class, but you can go through all of those, and it's kind of hard to read all 1,789 of her poems, but feel free to do so if you've got the time. They're worth it. So, because I could not stop for death. And we look at this first one. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. Think about this for a minute. First of all, let's take a look at what's something known as personification. Personification is giving of human qualities to a non-human entity. That can be animals, that can be objects, that can be concepts. So the concept of death is given human qualities here. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. Now think about how death is most of the time personified. Most of the time when people think of death as a personification, they think of something known as the Grim Reaper, which is in a black outfit with the black hood. Often you don't see the face, or if you do see the face, it's a skull. With the reaping tool for like, reaping wheat or something like that. And he comes to reap everybody's souls and take them to the afterlife. The Grim Reaper is usually a very, very scary personification of death. But not in Emily Dickinson's poem. He kindly stopped for me. Death decided to wait for just a second. Now, why could she not stop for death? Well, imagine if you were to die suddenly, say, like in the next day or so. If that were to happen, you probably weren't planning for it. Now, sometimes people get diagnosed with terminal illnesses such as Lou Gehrig's disease, and they do have the time to prepare for the death because they have no choice, at least not until ALS is cured. But sometimes death comes suddenly. We don't know it's coming. And once we die, it's not going to matter whether we've paid the phone bill or not. If we die, it's not really going to matter if you've turned in your homework or not. I mean, it's not going to matter. Nothing's going to matter when the time comes, when your number's up. When your number's up, it's up. So, because I could not stop for death, death kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. Alright, so, immortality has also been personified here. What is immortality? Of course, it's eternal life. So, here is the idea that death is not an ending, but rather the beginning of something eternal. And she's done that by personifying both death and immortality. And, oh, by the way, they're going on a nice, pleasant little carriage ride. Basically, death and immortality, or death is courting her like a gentleman caller, and immortality is kind of the carriage driver. All right. We slowly drove. He knew no haste. Death wasn't in any hurry. And I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. Again, we just talked about this, right? When death comes, well, okay, I didn't finish my homework assignment, but I guess I don't have to now. Death is here. I didn't pay the power bill, but that's okay because death is here. The collections agencies are not going to go to the cemetery looking for you and trying to extract money from you. They might try to extract money from the estate, of course, but that's for the lawyers to work out. All right. Now here's the next one. We passed a school where children strove at recess in the ring. So what game do you think they might be playing? Perhaps it's Ring Around the Rosie. Now, we think of Ring Around the Rosie as a child's game. We go around, ring around the rosy, pocket full of posy. We all fall down. And everybody falls and laughs and giggles and everybody has a great time. Ring Around the Rosie was actually not intended to be a fun child's game. It was a song about the plague, about death, because people were dying in the streets of London. So here are children. This is an irony. In fact, a lot of your fairy tales and a lot of your childhood games are based upon death and horror. Here is a childhood game being played, and it's a game that has its roots and its history in horrifying deaths. So, the children were playing at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. So think about this now. Fields of gazing grain. This is grain that's ready to be sowed. This is grain that's peak. And then we pass the setting sun. So this particular stanza, while the carriage is traveling, traveling past the parts of life. Childhood, school, the peak of life, and then the setting sun, which could be symbolic of death. So all of that's going on while the carriage is passing it. By the way, the life of those children will go on even after the narrator's dead. Then when those children die, the children that they have or the grandchildren they have, their lives will go on. So life goes on even in death. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown. Now, if you look at that gossamer, of course, it's a type of fabric. My tippet only tulle, and again, you've got notes telling you what tippet and tulle are. So, imagine, if you will, these are the burial clothes. So even though there's coldness in death, she's being buried in very thin fabrics. We passed before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. Okay. She's arriving at her final destination, her final home. At least the body is. Now, the soul is going to be riding in a carriage for all of eternity. But the body is arriving in its final home. Which, what do you suppose that is? Well, obviously, it's going to be the tomb in the ground. A swelling of the ground. What could the swelling of the ground mean? Well, possibly it means that the hole has been dug and the dirt is sitting right next to the hole, just like, a swelling of the ground, ready to be put back on top of the casket once the casket's lowered into that hole. So there's your swelling of the ground. I also like to think of this, that there might be some connection with pregnancy and childbirth. Yes, she's died, but from the ground, God made Adam and Eve, and therefore there could be some kind of a connection there, which could be worth exploring about the life out of death or something like that. All right. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. The cornice, of course, is the trim on the front of the roof. All right. So the roof of the house is scarcely visible, mainly because it was in the ground, and the cornice was already in it. Now take a look at this last stanza. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day. It's been centuries, yet feels shorter than the day. That is how time is distorted in eternity. So 500 years on Earth in eternity or in the afterlife might just seem like a single day. What a single day seems to us like here on Earth. So it's been centuries, yet feels like it's been shorter than a day. I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. So she's on this pleasurable carriage ride for the rest of eternity. Alright, so that is Because I Could Not Stop for Death by Emily Dickinson. It's about the hopefulness of an eternal life after death. And it makes death seem not quite so scary. And it's also about the cycle of life. About that whole rising sun, childhood, school, gazing grain, which is the peak of grain ready to be reaped, and then the setting sun, symbolizing the death. And this cycle will repeat itself through our children and through our grandchildren and through our great-grandchildren, and on for as many years as humanity happens to survive on Earth. Alright, that's Because I Could Not Stop for Death. Now, the other one I picked is interesting. I heard a fly buzz when I died. First of all, I really hope the last thing I hear in my lifetime is not a fly buzzing. I mean, how sad would that be? I'm finally going to expire. I'm going to go to heaven. Oh man, really? Gone. All right. I noticed I misspelled the word dies on that slide. That's fine. The narrator does not diss. The narrator dies. But let's take a look at the rest of that. So it's the final moments for death. The narrator is on her deathbed. And we're going to say her because, it was a woman that wrote it. So we can assume safely that the narrator is a her. All right. And the room is quiet except for that fly. So let's take a look at this, how this is written. I heard a fly buzz when I died. The stillness in the room was like the stillness in the air between the heaves of a storm. Now, if anybody's ever been through a hurricane, there's something called an eye of the hurricane, where the storm comes through, then the eye is over where you're at, and everything is quiet and still, and it looks like everything's over with. But there's more storm coming. So then, whoosh, and then of course more destruction. That calmness, there's so much calmness in this room as the narrator is about to expire that everything is standing still. Everything is quiet. There's that stillness like in like in the eye of a hurricane or between the heaves of a storm. The eyes round had wrung them dry. These people have cried themselves out. They have cried over the death of our narrator. They have cried and cried and cried. Now they just can't cry anymore. Their tear ducts are pretty much empty at this point. And breaths were gathering firm for that last onset, when the king be witnessed in the room. Who's the king? Well, if you believe that upon your death, Jesus will come and retrieve you, then perhaps that is the king that our narrator is talking about. That moment of death. Or, in this case, with that hopeful idea that Jesus is coming to retrieve you, therefore, in that moment, when the king arrives, everybody's waiting for that. Now, who's going to see the king? Probably only the narrator, nobody else. But they're still waiting for that moment when he will come and collect her. I willed my keepsakes, signed away what portion of me be assignable. So our narrator, knowing that she's going to die, has written a will. Anything that's assignable. So what's assignable? Well, houses, property, real estate, money, cash, keepsakes, trinkets, any of these things that are assignable, she has already given out and given to whomever wants them or whomever she deems should get them. What is not assignable? Perhaps a sense of humor. Perhaps a bright smile. Perhaps intelligence. I can't will intelligence to anybody. Either the person has it or they don't. I cannot will my sense of humor, which, warped as it may be, I cannot will my sense of humor to somebody else. If they don't have a sense of humor, they're still not going to have a sense of humor after I die. I can't say, okay, when I die, you get my sense of humor. You can't get that. So what has been assignable, or what is able to be willed to people, has been willed. And then it was there interposed a fly. Oh, for crying out loud. Last thing that this person is going to see is this fly. Oh, for goodness sakes. With blue, uncertain, stumbling buzz between the light and me. So, there's the light. What light are we talking about? People have said that when they died, they saw a light first. And then they went to the light, and then for whatever reason were pulled back into their mortal bodies. So people believe that there is a light that we go into when we die. There's the light. I'm about to experience whatever happens after death. Oh no, there's a fly between me and the light. Ah, not so good. And then the windows failed, and then I could not see the sea. The windows failing, of course, is the eyesight. So all of a sudden, blackout. Done. Nothing left. Death has approached. Now, there are people that have suggested that the fly buzzing is not really literally a fly, but literally something known as a death rattle, which is a kind of sound that is made by a person as soon as they die. In fact, many times people will know that someone has expired by the fact that the death rattle has happened. So it has been suggested that perhaps what the narrator is talking about hearing is actually a death rattle, not literally a fly. So I like to look at the comic effect of it. I'm dying. Oh, there's a fly. Wait, that's the last thing I saw. But you can also take it literally to mean the death rattle. So that is Emily Dickinson. A little bit morbid at times, but then there's a hopefulness to it. There's a type of I don't want to say enthusiasm, optimism. That's the word I'm looking for. There's a type of optimism that death is not an ending, but rather death can be a new beginning. Except maybe in the fly buzzing poem, where our narrator just saw nothing but blackness. In that case, perhaps not so fast. So, if you enjoyed these two poems and you really want to read some more Dickinson, there's several more in the book. And then, of course, you can probably check out a book from the library or something like that. So, on that note, I hope you've enjoyed the poetry of Emily Dickinson.